There are things Australia expects you to understand without anyone ever explaining them to you. Nobody hands you a rule book when you land at the airport. Nobody sits you down and says, here are the things you absolutely need to know if you want to fit in here. You are simply expected to figure it out. And the strange part is that some of these expectations seem completely invisible to Australians because they have grown up with them. But to an American arriving in Australia for the first time, they can become obvious almost immediately. You might think speaking English, being friendly, and following the law would be enough, but Australia has another layer of rules. They are social rules. Unspoken expectations. Little behaviors that can make you seem respectful and easygoing when you understand them, or completely out of place when you don't. And the first one is probably the most important because you can break it without even realizing you're doing anything wrong. Don't take yourself too seriously. In Australia, confidence is fine. Success is fine. Being proud of what you've achieved is fine. But there is a very thin line between confidence and acting like you're better than everyone else. Australians often have a strong preference for people who can laugh at themselves. You can be extremely successful, highly educated, wealthy, talented, or important in your profession. But if you constantly remind everyone how impressive you are, people may start looking at you very differently. And this is where an American visitor can sometimes misread Australian behavior. In America, openly talking about ambition and achievement can be seen as confidence. You might talk about your career, your business, your goals, the money you've made, or the things you've accomplished because these can be signals of success. In Australia, doing too much of that can produce the opposite reaction. People may respect what you've achieved, but they don't necessarily want you to keep announcing it. There's even a cultural idea often associated with Australia called tall poppy syndrome, the tendency to cut successful people down when they appear to think they're above everyone else. And here's the important part. Australians aren't necessarily telling you not to succeed. They're telling you not to act superior because you succeeded. That distinction matters. You can be the CEO of a company and still stand around making jokes with everyone else. You can earn a lot of money and still behave casually. You can have an impressive career and still be the person who helps clean up after a barbecue. That kind of humility can earn you more respect than constantly trying to prove how successful you are. And if you're visiting Australia from America, there's another expectation hiding right behind this one. Don't assume your job title automatically changes how people should treat you. A manager, doctor, lawyer, university professor, tradesperson, waiter, cleaner, and student can all interact casually in everyday Australian life. Of course, workplaces have hierarchies and responsibilities, but socially, Australians often place a lot of value on keeping things relatively informal. That's why you might hear someone casually call their boss by their first name. You might see people joking with someone who has a much higher position. And you might even hear a completely ordinary word like mate being used between people who barely know each other. But don't make the mistake of thinking mate always means you've become someone's close friend. Sometimes it means friendliness. Sometimes it means familiarity. Sometimes it simply means, I'm talking to you. And occasionally, depending on the tone, mate can mean almost the exact opposite of friendliness. That's one of the things Australia expects you to learn by listening rather than asking. And this is where the next rule becomes important, because Australians aren't just listening to what you say, they're paying attention to how you say it. Don't confuse friendliness with formality. An Australian can be friendly without giving you an enormous smile, a long introduction, or a formal conversation. A short, "How you going?" might genuinely be friendly. A quick joke might be an invitation to relax. And someone teasing you can actually be a sign that they feel comfortable around you. For someone unfamiliar with Australian culture, that can be confusing. You might think, are they making fun of me? Sometimes they are. But sometimes that's exactly how they're making you feel included. And once you understand that, Australian conversations can start to feel very different. But there is another expectation that catches visitors off guard even more, especially when they are trying too hard to be polite. And that's where Australia gets surprisingly direct. Australia can be friendly without being overly formal, and once you understand that, another expectation becomes much easier to recognize. Don't be afraid. In some cultures, people soften everything. They might avoid saying no because they don't want to appear rude. They might say, I'll see what I can do, when they already know the answer is probably no. Australians can be much more comfortable with simply telling you how things are. You ask if something is possible, and you might hear, nah, can't do that. You ask whether something is a good idea, and someone might say, honestly, probably not. And while that can sound blunt to an outsider, it isn't necessarily hostility. Sometimes it's actually the Australian way of being helpful. The expectation is that you won't fall apart because someone gave you an honest answer. And that connects to something Australians often value very highly. Don't create unnecessary drama. This may be one of the biggest differences an American notices. Imagine something goes wrong. Your delivery arrives late. The weather ruins your plans. A train is delayed. A restaurant makes a mistake. A piece of equipment stops working. In Australia, there can certainly be complaints. Australians aren't magically calm about everything. But there is often a cultural preference for not turning every inconvenience into a major emotional event. You might hear something like, "Yeah, that's annoying," then people move on. And that attitude can be difficult to understand if you're expecting a much stronger reaction. The Australian mindset is often less about pretending that problems don't exist, and more about asking whether the problem is actually worth getting worked up over. Because if you can't change it, getting furious isn't going to make the situation better. And this brings us to another expectation that visitors often discover the hard way. Don't make everything about yourself. Australia has a strong casual culture, and that means people often expect you to read the room. If everyone is joking, don't suddenly turn the conversation into a formal presentation. If everyone is relaxed, you don't necessarily need to impress everyone. If somebody makes a joke about themselves, they may be giving you permission to joke about yourself too. But there is a line. You can participate without trying to become the center of attention, and that's especially important in social situations. Australians can be incredibly welcoming, but they don't always expect you to walk into a room and immediately dominate the conversation. Sometimes the most socially successful person is the one who knows when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply join in. And there's another part of this that Americans may notice quickly. Don't mistake casual language for a lack of respect. Someone might say, "Mate," "no worries," "cheers," or throw a joke into a conversation that would sound surprisingly informal somewhere else. But casual doesn't necessarily mean careless. In fact, Australian informality can be a way of making interactions feel more equal. A conversation doesn't have to sound official to be respectful. And once you understand that, you start noticing the same attitude everywhere. At work, in shops, at cafes, at sporting events. Even when dealing with people you have never met before. But there's one place where this relaxed attitude absolutely does not mean you can ignore the rules. Australia expects you to respect the environment around you. This becomes especially obvious when you're outdoors. A beach might look like an open invitation. A national park might look like somewhere you can wander wherever you want. Wildlife might look harmless. But Australians generally understand that the natural environment isn't a theme park. There are signs for a reason. There are swimming flags for a reason. There are barriers for a reason. And there are places where you're simply expected to leave things alone. That includes wildlife. One of the worst mistakes a visitor can make is assuming that because an animal looks cute, it wants to be touched. A koala isn't a teddy bear. A wild kangaroo isn't a pet. And that tiny creature you found near a path may be far more capable of defending itself than it looks. The Australian expectation is simple. Look, appreciate it, photograph it from a safe distance, but don't interfere. And that same principle applies to the landscape itself. Take your rubbish with you. Stay on marked paths where required. Follow local warnings. Don't assume that because other people are doing something, it's automatically safe. Because Australia has another habit that visitors sometimes learn only after making a mistake. People expect you to take responsibility for your own safety. If a sign warns you about dangerous surf, you don't ignore it because the water looks beautiful. If you're told not to enter an area, you don't assume the warning is exaggerated. And if locals tell you that conditions can change quickly, you listen. Because Australia can look incredibly relaxed on the surface while still demanding a healthy amount of common sense. And that leads